My name is Sibusiso, and I live in a small village near a big forest. Life here is quiet. We plant food, fetch water, and sit by the fire at night telling stories. But there is one story that everyone is scared of. It's about a woman named Mandlovu. She lives alone at the edge of the forest. People say she is a witch. The elders tell us to stay away from her and never talk to her. Mandlovu only comes to the village on market days. She buys food and leaves quickly. People avoid her, but her daughter, Thandi, is different. Thandi is kind and always smiles. Everyone likes her, but no one understands why she still lives with her mother. One day, I was walking home after work. It was almost dark, and the air felt strange. Suddenly, I heard whispers coming from the trees. I froze. My heart started beating fast. Then I saw her, Mandlovu. She was standing on the path, looking right at me. Her eyes seemed to glow, even in the dim light. "Go home," she said in a low voice. "Stay away from my daughter." I didn't say anything. I just ran. I ran all the way home and locked the door. My hands were shaking, and my heart was still racing. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing her eyes in my mind. They were so sharp, like they could see right through me. I didn't know if she was warning me or threatening me, but I felt like something bad was going to happen. A few days later, I saw Thandi at the market. She was buying cassava and talking to one of the women selling vegetables. She looked happy, like nothing was wrong. I decided to talk to her. "Thandi," I said quietly, "is everything okay with your mother?" Thandi stopped smiling for a moment. Then she nodded. "She just worries about me," she said. But I could see something in her eyes. She looked tired, like she hadn't been sleeping well. I couldn't stop thinking about her. That evening, I made a decision. I wanted to know what was really going on. So, I followed her home. I stayed far behind Thandi as she walked back to her house. She didn't look back even once. The path to her house was narrow and covered with tall grass. It felt quiet, too quiet, like the birds had stopped singing. I kept walking, careful not to step on anything that might make a noise. The trees on the sides of the path were huge, their branches stretching out like they were trying to grab me. The air smelled different, wet and earthy. Soon I saw her house again. It looked small and lonely, sitting right where the forest started. The roof was made of old straw, and the walls looked like they would fall if the wind blew too hard. Thandi stopped in front of the house and looked around, like she was checking to see if anyone was watching. I quickly ducked behind a bush. She stood there for a moment, then went inside. I waited. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure someone would hear it. I didn't know what I was waiting for, but something told me not to leave yet. After a few minutes, the door opened again. This time, Mandlovu came out. She was carrying something wrapped in a cloth. I couldn't see what it was, but she held it carefully, like it was important. She walked to the middle of the yard, where a circle of stones surrounded an old fire pit. She placed the bundle in the fire pit and started humming a strange tune. It wasn't a song I had ever heard before. She pulled out some matches and lit the bundle on fire. The flames shot up quickly, and thick black smoke rose into the sky. It didn't look like normal smoke. It swirled around in circles, almost like it was alive. I crouched lower behind the bush, trying to stay hidden. Mandlovu began to speak. Her voice was low and soft at first, but then it got louder. She was saying words I didn't understand. It didn't sound like any language I knew. The fire grew brighter, and the shadows around her stretched across the yard. I stared at the smoke, and then I saw it, a shape forming inside the smoke. It looked like a person, but not a normal person. The figure was tall and skinny, with glowing red eyes. I felt my chest tighten. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Mandlovu raised her hands, and the figure in the smoke leaned toward her, as if it was listening to her words. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the figure disappeared, and the fire went out. Mandlovu stood there for a moment, looking at the ashes in the fire pit. Then she turned around, Her eyes went straight to where I was hiding. I froze. Did she see me? I wasn't sure. I stayed perfectly still, holding my breath. Finally, she walked back inside the house. As soon as the door shut, I got up and ran. I didn't look back, and I didn't stop running until I was back in the village. When I reached my house, I slammed the door shut and leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. My hands were shaking, and my mind was racing. What had I just seen? I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the glowing red eyes and the swirling smoke. What was Monlova doing out there? And who, or what, was she talking to? I needed answers, but I didn't know where to start. The day after I saw Monlova's ritual, something strange started happening in the village. People were getting sick. It started with a woman named Gogo Namsa. She was one of the elders and always strong and healthy. But that morning, she couldn't get out of bed. Her legs felt heavy, and she kept saying she felt like something was sitting on her chest. Then a young boy named Sifo fell ill. He couldn't eat, and his skin looked pale. His mother said he had been fine the night before, but now he couldn't even sit up. By the afternoon, 3 more people were sick. They all said the same thing. They felt weak, like the life was being pulled out of them. The village was worried. I couldn't stop thinking about what I saw the night before, the fire, the smoke, and that strange figure. I didn't want to believe it, but a voice in my head kept asking, could it be connected? The elders called a meeting in the middle of the village. Everyone gathered around the big tree, whispering nervously. Themba, my best friend, stood next to me. Do you think it's Monlova? He asked, his voice low. I didn't answer. I didn't want to say it out loud, but I could see the fear in his eyes. One of the elders, Baba Dlamini, spoke first. This sickness is not normal, he said. It has come too quickly. We must pray to the ancestors for guidance. Another elder, Mama Jabu, shook her head. Praying is not enough. We need to find out who has brought this evil to our village. The crowd murmured in agreement. Then someone said what everyone was thinking. It's Monlova, a woman shouted. She's the one bringing this curse. The crowd went silent. Everyone turned to look at the woman who had spoken. Her name was Zanil, and she was always the first to point fingers when something went wrong. She's a witch, Zanil continued. We all know it. She's been doing strange things for years. Themba leaned closer to me. Do you think she's right? He whispered. I didn't answer. My chest felt tight. I wanted to tell him what I had seen, but something held me back. Baba Dlamini raised his hand, and the crowd quieted down. We cannot accuse someone without proof, he said. We will send someone to speak with her. The villagers didn't look happy, but they nodded. No one wanted to admit it, but everyone was scared of Monlova. That night, I couldn't sleep again. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The faces of the sick people kept flashing in my mind. So did the figure in the smoke. I thought about Thandi. She didn't seem sick, but she looked tired when I saw her at the market. What if Monlova's rituals were meant to protect her? What if they were hurting everyone else? I decided I had to talk to Thandi again. Maybe she could tell me what was really happening. But part of me was scared. If Monlova found out, what would she do to me? That night, I finally fell asleep, but it didn't feel like rest. My sleep was heavy, like I was trapped in it. Then, the dream began. I was back on the path to Monlova's house. The forest felt darker, the trees taller, their shadows longer. The air was cold, and I could hear whispers all around me, but I couldn't tell where they were coming from. I kept walking, even though I didn't want to. It felt like something was pulling me forward. My legs moved on their own, step by step, until I reached her yard. The fire pit was there again, but this time, the fire was already lit. The black smoke rose high into the air, twisting and swirling like it was alive. The strange figure was back, too. It stood in the smoke, staring at me with its glowing red eyes. I tried to turn and run, but my feet wouldn't move. It felt like the ground was holding me in place. The figure raised a hand, pointing straight at me. You should not have come, a voice said. It wasn't the figure speaking. It was Monlovu. She stepped out of the shadows, holding something in her hand. It was a small wooden doll, carved to look like a person. She looked at me with those sharp eyes of hers and began to chant. The whispers in the air grew louder, swirling around me. My chest felt tight, and I couldn't breathe. The figure in the smoke moved closer, its eyes glowing brighter. Stop! I shouted. Suddenly, I woke up. I sat up in bed, gasping for air. My room was dark, but I could still feel the cold from the dream. My heart was racing, and my shirt was soaked with sweat. I looked around, trying to calm myself. It was just a dream, I whispered to myself. But it didn't feel like just a dream. It felt too real. The next morning, I went to fetch water from the river. On the way back, I saw Themba. He waved at me and ran over. You look like you didn't sleep, he said. I nodded. I had a dream. It was about Monlovu. Themba frowned. What happened? I told him everything, the fire, the smoke, the figure, and the dolls she was holding. When I finished, Themba looked scared. That's not just a dream, he said. That's a warning. A warning for what? I asked. I don't know, he said, lowering his voice. But I think you're in danger. You shouldn't have gone near her house, Sibusiso. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, but deep down, I knew he was right. Something was very wrong, and it had started the moment I followed Thandi home. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. The dream, the sickness in the village, and what I saw at Monlovu's house, it was all connected. I knew I needed to talk to Thandi again, even if it was risky. The next day, I waited near the market. Thandi always came to buy food around midday, so I stood near one of the stalls, pretending to look at mangoes. When I saw her, she looked even more tired than before. Her eyes had dark circles under them, and her shoulders sagged like she was carrying a heavy load. She smiled at the woman selling cassava, but it didn't reach her eyes. When she turned to leave, I followed her. Thandi, I called out softly. She stopped and looked back. Her eyes widened when she saw me, but then she quickly glanced around, as if checking if anyone was watching. What are you doing here? She whispered. You shouldn't be talking to me. I need to know what's going on, I said. Thandi, people are getting sick. And your mother, she's doing something strange. I saw her. Thandi's face turned pale. You shouldn't have been there, she said, her voice shaking. She doesn't like people spying on her. What is she doing, Thandi? I asked. Please, I just want to help. Thandi looked down at the ground, her hands clutching the basket she was holding. For a moment, I thought she wouldn't say anything. But then she whispered, She's trying to protect me. Protect you from what? I asked. Thandi looked up, her eyes filled with fear. There's something in the forest, she said. Something dangerous. My mother, she made a deal to keep it away from me. But now it wants more. What does it want? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She shook her head. I don't know. She doesn't tell me everything. But I know the sickness, it's part of the deal. Whatever she's doing, it's hurting people in the village. I stared at her, my heart pounding. Thandi, we have to stop her. Thandi's eyes filled with tears. You don't understand, she said. If we stop her, it might come for me. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Thandi was trapped, and so was the village. If Monlovu kept her rituals going, more people might get sick. But if she stopped, something worse could happen to Thandi. Meet me tonight, I said. Near the big tree. We'll figure something out. Thandi hesitated, then nodded. Okay, she whispered. But you have to promise. Promise you won't go near the forest again. I nodded, even though I wasn't sure I could keep that promise. As Thandi walked away, I felt the weight of what she had told me. Whatever Monlovu had done, it wasn't just a problem for her or her daughter. It was a problem for all of us. That night, I waited near the big tree in the center of the village. It was quiet, with only the sound of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The moon was high, casting a pale light over the ground. I kept looking around, worried that someone might see me. If the elders knew I was meeting Thandi, they would be angry. Everyone was already on edge because of the sickness. Finally, I saw her. Thandi came walking quickly, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She looked nervous, her eyes darting around the dark village. "You came," I said softly. She nodded. "I don't have much time. If my mother finds out, I don't know what she'll do." I stepped closer, keeping my voice low. "Thandi, we have to stop her. Whatever your mother is doing, it's hurting people. Gogo Namsa is still sick, and now 3 more children can't get out of bed. This can't keep happening." Thandi's face was full of pain. "I know," she said. "But I don't know how to stop her. She won't listen to me. She says the only way to keep me safe is to keep doing the rituals. Then we need to figure out what this thing in the forest is," I said. "If we understand it, maybe we can find another way to protect you without hurting anyone else." Thandi shook her head quickly. "No. You don't understand. It's not just a thing. It's a spirit. A powerful one. My mother says it's older than the trees, older than the village itself. She says it watches us and waits for us to make mistakes." Her words made my skin crawl. "Why does it want you?" I asked. "I don't know," she whispered. "She won't tell me. But I think she made a mistake a long time ago. And now, it's coming for me because of her." I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. If Mamlova had made some kind of deal with the spirit, then this wasn't something the village could fight on its own. But we couldn't just let her keep doing the rituals either. "Thandi," I said carefully, "what if we talk to the elders? Maybe they can help." She grabbed my arm, her grip tight. "No," she said. "You can't tell anyone. If they find out, they'll come for my mother. And if they hurt her, the spirit will come for me." I swallowed hard. "Then what do we do?" Thandi looked down at the ground, her shoulders slumping. "I don't know," she said. "But I'll try to talk to her again. Maybe I can convince her to stop." "Be careful," I said. "If she finds out you've been talking to me, she might get angry." Thandi nodded. "You be careful too. Don't go near our house again. If she sees you—" She didn't finish the sentence, but I knew what she meant. As she turned to leave, I felt a chill run through me. This wasn't just about Thandi or her mother anymore. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than all of us. And I was starting to realize that stopping it might come at a cost. The next morning, the village was even quieter than usual. People were staying in their homes, afraid of the sickness spreading. I wanted to talk to Themba about what Thandi told me, but I didn't think he would believe me. I decided to visit Baba Dlamini, the eldest man in the village. He knew all the old stories and legends. Maybe he could tell me more about the spirit in the forest. Baba Dlamini sat outside his hut, carving a piece of wood into the shape of a bird. His hands were slow but steady. When he saw me, he smiled. "Sibusiso," he said, "you look troubled. Sit with me." I sat on the ground next to him, feeling nervous. "Baba," I began, "I need to ask you something about the forest." He stopped carving and looked at me closely. "The forest?" he said. "Why would a young man like you want to know about such a place?" I hesitated, then said, "I've heard stories about a spirit that lives there. Something old and dangerous. Is it real?" Baba Dlamini's face grew serious. He put down the carving and leaned back against the wall of his hut. "Ah, you speak of the Amoya Omnima," he said. "The dark spirit." The name sent a shiver down my spine. "What is it?" I asked. "It is not a thing that can be easily explained," he said. "The Amoya Omnima has been here long before our people came to this land. It lives in the deepest parts of the forest, where the trees block out the sun. It does not bother us if we leave it alone. But if someone angers it. He paused, his eyes distant, as if remembering something. Many years ago, a woman in the village tried to use the spirit's power for her own gain. She thought she could control it. But the spirit is not something you can control. It is like fire, useful, but dangerous. Her actions brought sickness to the village, just like now. What happened to her? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She paid the price, he said. The spirit does not forgive easily. And sometimes, the punishment does not end with the one who caused it. It can pass down, affecting their children, even their grandchildren. I felt my chest tighten. What if someone tried to make a deal with it to protect someone they love? Baba Dlamini's eyes narrowed. Then they are a fool, he said. The spirit does not give without taking something in return. The more it gives, the more it takes. And if it is not satisfied, it will come for more. His words confirmed what I had feared. Monlova had made a deal with the spirit to protect Thandi, but now the village was paying the price. Baba, I said, is there a way to stop it? He sighed heavily. There is only one way, he said. The person who made the deal must undo it. But this is not easy. The spirit will not let go without a fight. And the one who tries to break the deal must be willing to pay the final price. What price? I asked. Sometimes it is their life, he said. Sometimes it is something worse. I left Baba Dlamini's hut feeling more confused and afraid than ever. If Monlova was the only one who could stop the spirit, then convincing her would be nearly impossible. And if she refused, what would happen to Thandi? I needed to warn her, but I didn't know if I could face Monlova again. That evening, I found Themba sitting under the big tree near his house. He was whittling a stick with his knife, something he always did when he was bored. Themba, I said, sitting next to him. He looked up and frowned. You've got that look again, he said. What's wrong now? I hesitated. I didn't know if I should tell him everything. But I couldn't handle this alone anymore. I've been talking to Thandi, I said. His eyes widened. What? Are you crazy? If the village finds out, they'll think you're helping Monlova. I don't care, I said. Something bad is happening, Themba. People are getting sick, and I think it has to do with her mother's rituals. Thandi told me her mother made a deal with a spirit to protect her, but now it's hurting everyone else. Themba dropped the stick and stared at me. A spirit? Yes, I said. Baba Dlamini called it the Amoya Omnima. He said it's ancient and dangerous, and the only way to stop it is for Monlova to undo the deal. But I don't think she will. Themba shook his head, his face pale. Why would she do something like that? Everyone knows you can't mess with spirits. They always take more than they give. She did it for Thandi, I said. But now the whole village is paying the price. What are you going to do? He asked. I don't know, I admitted. But I can't just sit here and do nothing. Maybe if we find out more about the spirit, we can figure out a way to stop it without Monlova. Themba frowned. You're talking about going into the forest, aren't you? I nodded. You're insane, he said. Do you know how dangerous that is? The forest isn't safe, even during the day. And if this spirit is real, it's not something we can fight with sticks and knives. I know, I said. But I have to try. If we don't do something, more people will get sick. And what if it gets worse? Themba looked like he wanted to argue, but then he sighed. Fine, he said. But I'm coming with you. If you're stupid enough to go into the forest, someone has to make sure you don't get yourself killed. Relief washed over me. I didn't want to go alone, and Themba was the only person I trusted. Thank you, I said. Don't thank me yet, he said, picking up his knife again. We need a plan. If we're going into the forest, we can't just wander around like fools. We need to know what we're looking for. I'll talk to Thandi again, I said. Maybe she knows more about the spirit or where it lives. Themba nodded. And we'll need supplies. Water, food, something to protect ourselves. Like what? I asked. He grinned, though it didn't reach his eyes. I don't know. A big stick, maybe. Despite the fear twisting in my stomach, I managed a small smile. Themba always knew how to make me feel less scared. Tomorrow, I said. We'll figure it out tomorrow. As I walked home that night, I tried to ignore the fear creeping into my mind. The forest was dangerous, and the spirit was even worse. But I couldn't let that stop me. Thandi was counting on me. The village was counting on me. The next morning, I woke up before the sun rose. My stomach was tied in knots, and my hands felt clammy. I tried to eat a piece of bread, but I couldn't swallow it. I met Themba near the big tree. He had a small sack slung over his shoulder. You ready? He asked, though his voice didn't sound too sure. Ready as I'll ever be, I said, trying to sound brave. Thandi showed up a little while later. Her face was pale, and her eyes were red like she had been crying. She clutched a small basket to her chest. You don't have to come, I told her. Yes, I do, she said firmly. This is my fault, too. I can't let you go into the forest alone. Themba sighed. Fine, but if we get caught, you're explaining this to your mother. Thandi didn't respond. She just looked down at the ground. Before we left, Themba handed me a stick he had carved into a sharp point. It's not much, but it's better than nothing, he said. I nodded, gripping it tightly. I wasn't sure a stick would help against the spirit, but it made me feel a little less helpless. The three of us headed toward the forest. The closer we got, the quieter it became. Even the birds stopped singing. The trees loomed over us, their branches twisting like long fingers. As we stepped into the forest, I felt the air change. It was colder here, and the sunlight barely broke through the thick leaves above. Every step we took made the ground crunch softly under our feet. Do you know where we're going? Themba asked, looking at Thandi. She shook her head. I just know it's deep in the forest. My mother never told me exactly where. Great, Themba muttered. So we're wandering into a cursed forest with no plan. Perfect. I ignored him and kept walking. The deeper we went, the stranger the forest felt. The trees seemed to lean toward us, and the air smelled sour, like rotting fruit. Then we heard it, a soft whisper, like the wind, but there was no wind. Did you hear that? Themba asked, his voice shaking. We all stopped and listened. The whisper came again, low and faint, like someone speaking just out of reach. It's the spirit, Thandi whispered. I tightened my grip on the stick. Let's keep moving, I said. We walked for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a short time. The forest seemed to stretch forever, and every direction looked the same. Finally, we came to a clearing. In the middle of it was a large stone, covered in strange markings. It looked old, older than anything I'd ever seen. Thandi gasped. This is it, she said. How do you know? Themba asked. My mother used to draw those symbols in the dirt, she said, pointing to the markings on the stone. She said they keep the spirit calm. The stone pulsed with a strange energy. I could feel it, like a heartbeat in the air. What do we do now? Themba asked, looking around nervously. Before I could answer, the whispers grew louder. They were all around us now, coming from the trees, the ground, everywhere. Then, the air in front of the stone shimmered, like heat rising off the road on a hot day. A dark shape began to form, twisting and swirling until it looked like a figure. Its eyes glowed red, just like in my dream. Themba grabbed my arm. We need to leave. Now. But I couldn't move. The figure stared at us, its eyes boring into mine. I felt frozen, like my feet were stuck to the ground. The spirit spoke, its voice low and deep. Who dares enter my domain? My mouth went dry. I couldn't speak, couldn't even think. Thandi stepped forward, her voice shaking but firm. It's me, she said. Thandi. My mother sent us. The spirit tilted its head, its red eyes narrowing. Lies, it hissed. She would never send you here. I reached out to grab Thandi's hand, But it was too late. The spirit moved closer, its dark form towering over us. "Leave," it said, "or suffer." The spirit's voice echoed around the clearing, shaking the air. "Leave, or suffer." I felt my knees tremble. Themba grabbed my arm, his grip so tight it hurt. "Sibusiso, we need to run," he whispered urgently. Thandi didn't move. She stood frozen in front of the stone, her fists clenched tightly around her basket. "Please," she said, her voice trembling. "We're not here to hurt you. We just want to know how to stop this." The spirit's glowing red eyes narrowed, and the whispers around us grew louder. The air felt thick, like it was hard to breathe. "You think you can bargain with me?" the spirit hissed. "You, the child of the one who dared to cheat me?" Themba pulled harder on my arm. "We're going to die if we stay here," he said through gritted teeth. But I couldn't leave Thandi. "Thandi, we have to go," I said, my voice shaking. She looked back at me, her eyes full of tears. "If we leave, it'll keep hurting people," she said. "We can't just run away." The spirit moved closer, its shadowy form growing larger. "You cannot stop me," it said. "Your mother's debt is not yet paid. And now you belong to me." Thandi gasped, stepping back. "No," she said. "I didn't do anything." Themba let go of my arm and grabbed a stone from the ground. "Stay away from her," he shouted, hurling the rock at the spirit. It passed through the dark figure like smoke, vanishing into the shadows. The spirit laughed, a low, rumbling sound that made my skin crawl. "Foolish boy," it said. "You cannot fight what you do not understand." Suddenly, the ground beneath us began to tremble. The trees around the clearing seemed to sway, though there was no wind. "We need to go!" I shouted, grabbing Thandi's arm. This time, she didn't resist. Together, we turned and ran, with Themba close behind us. The whispers grew louder, chasing us through the forest like a swarm of angry bees. Branches clawed at our clothes and faces as we sprinted through the trees. My chest burned from running, but I didn't dare slow down. "Keep going!" Themba yelled. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if the spirit was following us. Finally, we burst out of the forest and into the village. The whispers stopped, and the air felt lighter. I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath. Thandi sat beside me, her face pale and her hands shaking. Themba leaned against a tree, his chest heaving. "What was that?" he panted. "The spirit," I said, my voice hoarse. "It knows who Thandi is. It's angry." Thandi buried her face in her hands. "This is my fault," she said. "If my mother hadn't made that deal, it's not your fault," I said firmly. "You didn't ask for this. But we need to figure out what to do now. We can't just leave things the way they are." Themba shook his head. "That thing told us to stay away. If we go back, it might kill us." I looked at Thandi, who still looked terrified but determined. "We can't give up," I said. "If we don't stop it, more people in the village will get sick. Maybe worse." Thandi wiped her eyes and nodded. "We'll find another way," she said. "There has to be something we can do." As we sat there catching our breath, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were running out of time. The spirit wasn't going to wait forever. And neither could we. Themba left soon after, saying he needed to tell his father he'd been gathering firewood in case anyone asked where he was. I understood. If the elders found out we'd been in the forest, we'd all be in trouble. Thandi and I stayed near the edge of the forest, sitting quietly under a tree. She hadn't said much since we escaped, and I could tell she was deep in thought. "Thandi," I said gently, "what aren't you telling me?" She looked up at me, her eyes tired. "What do you mean?" "You knew about the spirit," I said. "And the stone. You recognized the symbols. There's more you haven't told me, isn't there?" She hesitated, then nodded slowly. "There is," she said. "But I was scared to say it." I waited, giving her time to find the words. "My mother didn't just make a deal with the spirit," she said quietly. "She tricked it." I frowned. What do you mean? She pulled her knees to her chest, hugging them tightly. Years ago, before I was born, my mother went to the forest to ask the spirit for help. She was desperate. Something bad was happening in the village, and people were blaming her for it. She told me she asked the spirit to protect her, to make her untouchable. I listened carefully, trying to piece it together. And the spirit agreed? Thandi shook her head. Not exactly. The spirit said it would protect her, but only if she gave it something in return. My mother promised to pay the price later, but when the time came, she found a way to avoid it. What did she do? I asked. She used me, Thandi said, her voice barely above a whisper. She offered the spirit my life instead of hers. But she didn't tell me until recently. All this time, I thought the rituals were to protect me. But they were really to keep the spirit from coming to collect what it's owed. I stared at her, my mind racing. So, that's why it's after you now. Because of what she did? Thandi nodded, tears streaming down her face. I don't blame her for wanting to protect herself, but now everyone is suffering because of her mistake. The spirit is angry, and it's taking its anger out on the village. I felt a heavy weight settle in my chest. Did your mother ever tell you how to stop it? She said there's no way, Thandi said. Once the spirit has been angered, it won't stop until it gets what it wants. I clenched my fists. That can't be true. There has to be a way to fix this without sacrificing you. Thandi looked at me, her eyes filled with fear and hope. You really think so? I don't know, I admitted. But we have to try. Maybe Baba Dlamini knows more. Or maybe there's something in the forest we missed. We can't give up now. She wiped her tears and nodded. Okay. I'll help. But we have to be careful. If my mother finds out we're trying to stop the spirit, she'll be furious. I nodded. We'll figure this out, Thandi. I promise. As the sun began to set, we made our way back to the village. I couldn't stop thinking about what Thandi had told me. The spirit wasn't just a problem for the village, it was a problem for her family. And now, it was a problem for me too.